Hi, my name is Dr. Cassandra Holyfield. Today I'm going to go over an IEP meeting and document review checklist that was created by Georgia Learning Resources System. As you know, an IEP, an individual education plan, is extremely important for special ed students and for special ed meetings. Meeting IDEA compliance, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is extremely important for making sure that all students with disabilities have FAPE, a free appropriate public education. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to quickly go over the meeting list and the document review. So on my screen, I'm going to go through and I'm going to share, for compliance and fidelity purposes, the types of information that needs to be included as you go through the entire IEP process. We're going to start off by looking in the first section here. You're going to document whether or not the IEP meeting is for an annual review, an amendment, or an other. An other is typically something like a progress meeting or something like that to go over the goals. The next section is the meeting checklist. These are all the things that are needed in order for you to have a very orderly meeting where everyone is coming prepared to the meeting. The last section is the paperwork checklist. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go over the different sections of the IEP meeting and document review, and then we're going to go through the meeting checklist items first. The first thing to the left is you need to make sure for the meeting checklist that you have notified and invited all the participants that need to be there. Again, this is something that is required by IDEA, that the students, the parents, other stakeholders, the case manager, social worker, school psychologist, whomever that is a part of the student's educational and program planning needs to be invited to the meeting. You want to make sure that you have an agenda where the meeting begins with a start time, you have a purpose of the meeting that you explain, the participants are introduced at the meeting, and you have parental rights that are offered to the parents. You also want to make sure that a draft copy of the IEP has been provided to the parents. You want to offer that to them again at the day of the meeting, but that meeting, the IEP should have been sent home, the draft IEP, within 7 to 10 days prior to this meeting. The other part that you want to make sure is that all of the required participants are present. I talked about that a little earlier. You need to make sure the LEA rep is there. And the LEA rep is somebody from the district who has the authority to commit services. A general ed teacher, a special ed teacher, the parents or grandparents or the other guardians need to be there, legal guardians. The student, if a transition is being offered, so at 9th grade or 14 in the state of Georgia, any kind of related service providers like OT, PT, school psychologists, social workers, those sorts of people. Then you want to go into the review of the progress on the goals. So you want to make sure that you look at the present levels of performance, and you want to talk about the graphs and whether or not the goals that were set at the last IEP, whether the student has mastered those goals or whether they have not mastered those goals. The next on the meeting checklist is you want to make sure that you have a transition plan, if appropriate, and this is depending on the child's age, that you want to make sure that any agency representative is there to go over any kinds of transition services that the child may need, want, or they are able to provide. You also want to make sure that any transition assessments are there, that you're able to talk about those, because a transition plan should be based on the student's likes. So this information should come directly from the transition assessments. Those assessments can be an informal transition assessment or a formal transition assessment. The next section is extremely important. You want to make sure that you go over the IEP in these exact orders. So you want to talk about the PLAF. The PLAF is the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, and you want to go over the evaluations and the assessments, and you want to provide the technical information, but you also, when you're talking with the parents, you want to make sure that you share this in a language and with vocabulary that they can understand, because in special ed we use a lot of acronyms, so you want to avoid that as much as possible unless you also provide an explanation of what those explanations are. So in this particular section, you're talking about the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, the evaluation and assessments that will be discussed. The next section, based on the data from the evaluations and the assessment, you're going to talk about the child's strengths and their needs based on that assessment and evaluation data. Then the next thing that you're going to discuss in the IEP meeting is the parental concerns and the impact that child's disability has on their performance in the general ed setting. So this is a discussion that is had that the special educators and all the other stakeholders at the table have been working directly with the students, but we want to make sure that the parents have an opportunity to provide their impact about concerns that they have at school or at home. So that is included in the conversation so we can make sure that the parents are collaborative partners in this process. The special factors, we look at that to see whether or not the child has hearing and vision issues, if they need assistive technology, other conversations like that we need to make sure whether or not they have a functional behavior assessment or a behavior intervention plan. Then the next section that you'll go over in a IEP meeting is the annual goals. You want to make sure that based again, when we talked about the evaluations and the assessment, that we have annual goals. These are goals that the student will perform over the course of the year. Those will be broken down into smaller tasks as we go out, but the annual goals are what the child will need to know by the end of the year, and that's going to be the next section that you talk about in the meeting. Then you move on to the accommodations. The purpose of talking about the accommodations is you're going to individualize and provide accommodation based on each individual student's IEP needs, because this may vary for different students. We might need small group, you might need instructions read to the students, but this is really important in order for that student to make progress. The next area of the conversation is supplementary aids and services. Again, this is the need for personnel supports. You will have conversations about the child's specific needs and whether or not they need maybe say a one-on-one or individual parapro that is designated for themselves. The next section is you talk about special education service options and considered and placement. So this is the placement options. For all students with disabilities, the general ed classroom is always the first place that you want to consider for the LRE, the least restrictive environment. In this conversation, you talk about all the things that the child needs, the services that need to be provided, and the pros and cons of what environment is going to best suit the needs of an individual student. The next part on the meeting agenda is the extent in which the student will not participate with his or her same age grade peers, and with an explanation of why. This goes back to you talking about the child's disability and how it impacts his or her educational performance. ESY is the next thing on the agenda. Typically this conversation is brought up, but you have that conversation in the spring to determine whether or not the child is making progress and whether or not they need extended school year, which is different than summer school. This is actual instructional that is based on the child's IEP. And then you have general conversation on the agenda to just kind of tie up any loose ends. You get additional parental and student input. You have basically it's kind of an open forum where you talk about pros and cons and other things that need to take place during the meeting or preparing for the next meeting. So that's a general quick checklist of the meeting items. So let's just go back up to the top. So this is how you have an orderly meeting. The next part of the IEP meeting and document review is about the paperwork checklist. So we talked about the order in which we're going to have this meeting, but now you actually have to have these documents ready and prepared for the meeting. So again, you want to have the notice of invitation that is sent out, and you want to make sure you've invited all of the required members. So as you can see here's a list of all the required members. So you want to make sure that every meeting that you invite the LEA rep, which is a district representative. You want to have a general ed teacher, the parents, the students if appropriate, other related service providers. So that is the notice of invitation. Then the meeting begins. Okay, so we talked about what happens in the next section, but you want to make sure that the eligibility date is current and correct, especially student eligibility lasts for 3 years. So you want to make sure that that's not expired, or if it's about to expire, you want to gain parental consent so you can do another one. We talked about a second ago, we sent out the invitations. Now this is just the required participants present. This is where we have all of these required members. However, there are some times that it's very difficult to get a general ed teacher to an IEP meeting. That should be the exception and not the norm. So if that is the case, you can ask the parents if they will excuse a particular participant from participating in that agreement. If they agree that they will excuse a general ed teacher, you can continue on. But if they say they will not excuse the general ed teacher, then the meeting has to be tabled and to be rescheduled to another day. The next section that you want to make sure that you have for your paperwork as we talk about the review of progress on goals, we want to make sure that we have all the specific IEP, academic and behavioral goals that are graphed, and we can have a conversation about whether progress is being made, whether new interventions are needed, and whether or not those interventions have been implemented with fidelity, and whether or not the student is making progress. This is on academic and behavioral goals. The next section, if applicable, remember transition planning is required at 9th grade or age 14 in Georgia. So if applicable, you want to make sure that you have ready to talk about the completion of the transition goals. This again comes from conversations with the students and survey data where they've explained what it is they want to do when they graduate from high school. So you're preparing them for opportunities to be ready for work or to go into college and or other types of vocational skills. You want to talk about the preferences, their strengths, their interests, and you want to make sure that you go over the course of study, which is going to help them prepare to enter into the world of work or college after graduation. The next section for the paperwork checklist is we talked about the PLAF evaluation and assessments. Again, present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. You want to go over the state and district results, and you want to be able to talk about those that are age appropriate, grade appropriate, so you can be able to compare how an individual student is doing against how he is doing with his same age and grade level peers. This rolls right into the next area, which talks about the PLAF strengths and needs. Again, based on this data that you receive from the evaluation and the assessments, you're going to talk about the areas of strength, the areas of need, and how you can build upon the strengths and provide additional supports to address the student's needs. Again, you go from that point into the conversation about parental concerns as it relates to progress and or areas of need, and what is the parent's input. Again, a parent is a viable member of the IEP team, and we need to make sure that we include them in the conversation, ask them frequently if they have any questions, and again, what kind of contributing information can they help us see and understand so we could better meet the needs of their child. The next section, we talk about special factors. So you want to make sure that we have a specific statement describing the student's specific need. If there's a behavioral need, we need to make sure that we have a FBA, functional behavior assessment, or behavior intervention. If the child has some kind of visual disability, we might have to consider whether or not the child needs large print or the use of assistive technology. As we've gone over that assessment data, we then go back into the annual goals, looking at the evaluation and the assessment results, and then we develop behavioral and academic goals that are set forth for the entire year, and then we chunk those over smaller tasks that we will progress monitor to make sure that the student is on his or her way into meeting the annual goal. As we talk about those annual goals based on data, you talk about the accommodations, the different accommodations that have been put in place for that child to meet the needs. This is bridging the gap between their areas of strength and their area of weakness. It's really important, though, that as you look at putting in accommodations, that you keep in mind what are the standardized testing accommodations, because it's I caution you to not use accommodations that you cannot use when it's time for the state and or district assessments, because you've provided the child with a scaffold that they won't be able to utilize if it is not on the approved accommodations list. That list is updated by the State Department every year. Then you move into the next section, supplemental aids and services for support personnel. Again, we talked about whether or not we need any special staffing needs, if we need special help with taking notes, graphic organizers, tutoring, that sort of thing. Then we go into the next section of special education services, the options considered and accepted. So this is where you put all of the different pieces on the table and you talk about whether or not this is appropriate for the student, whether or not they can be served in the general ed setting, where they need to be in a co-taught environment, all the way up to the full continuum of whether or not they need self-contained services. Next, we go into least restrictive environment. So we've considered all of the options on the table. Then it is up to the IEP team at that point to say what's viable for the student and what's not. And then you fully considered everything. Then what did the IEP team actually deem as the most appropriate for that child to be able to receive their special education services and be successful? The next section, again, we're up to the spring, is when you have that progress meeting or IEP meeting later on in the spring. You're going to talk about all of the data, whether a child is progressing academically, behaviorally, and whether or not, if there is a concern about regression, the team will consider whether ESY extended services are needed throughout the summer. Then lastly, you wrap it up and you talk about other things to get clarification. Everything is put in the minutes. People agree or disagree. You can have dissenting members at an IEP meeting because it is not a vote. And this is how you prepare from a meeting checklist, and this is how you become to a meeting prepared, is to have all of this data listed in the paperwork checklist guide ready for review at an IEP meeting. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.